All right, so before we can start learning HTML and CSS, we need to install the tools we need for this course. And compared to my other courses on topics like Node or MySQL, installation here is really easy and painless because we don't actually have to install HTML and CSS as separate downloads, unlike if we take Node as an example. You have to download it, the installer, you have to run it, you have to make sure you have the right installer for your system, you have to open up the command line and test it out, change some settings. We don't have to do any of that here. All we need is a place to write our code, a text editor, and then a place to render our code, which is exactly what a web browser does, right? A browser takes code, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and renders it into something we can look at and interact with as a web page. And if you're watching this course, you probably have a web browser, unless you illegally pirated this and you're watching it locally. I believe you have to be watching it in a browser, so you already have one. But with that said, I recommend installing Chrome. It doesn't have to be Chrome. That's what I'm going to be using, and I recommend it for two reasons. One, it's a modern web browser. There's also Firefox. That's a modern web browser. It generally tends to have the newest features implemented early on. Unlike, say, if you're trying to use Edge or Microsoft Internet Explorer, I would advise against that. That's one reason. They tend to be slower to update things compared to Chrome and Firefox. But the second reason is I'm going to be using specifically Chrome in this course, and I'm going to be using the developer tools. So you'll see me do things like this, where we open up developer tools, we look at different pieces, we look at different tabs here. And the dev tools are somewhat similar from one browser to the next, but they'll look a little different if you're using Firefox. So to have the exact same experience where, if I click this layout button and I check this checkbox, to get that exact same experience, you're going to want to use Chrome. So Chrome, if you don't have it, I would go ahead and install it. Not a requirement, but just click download Chrome at google.com/Chrome. I'll include a link to it attached to this video as well. And that's what I'm going to be using. So that's the first piece, that's our browser. And then the second thing we need is a place to write our code. And I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code or VS Code. There are many great editors out there, free and paid. If you have a fancy editor like WebStorm, you can use that. But we don't need anything crazy. We just need a nice place to write code. You could do it in a plain text editor. You could even do it in Microsoft Word. Don't advise that. Definitely that would be a mistake because you'd miss out on some of the nice features we get from Visual Studio Code. So download VS Code if you don't have it. There's a link attached to this video as well. Just click download here. It's totally free. Open it up when it's done. And in the next video, I'm going to walk you through some of the things I've changed. The colors, some of the extensions I want you to download. None of it's required. You can do this in any text editor and any browser, but those are the two recommendations I have. And if you want the exact same shortcuts, the same experience as me, you're going to want VS Code as your editor and Chrome as your browser. Welcome back. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about configuring VS Code. This is all relatively optional, but I'm just going to show you some of the settings that I have. So I have VS Code open. I've opened it up, and it probably looks a little bit different than what your VS Code looks like, at least in terms of colors. And that's because I've changed the theme of my VS Code. So that's the first thing I'm going to show you how to do. A lot of students tend to care about this, even if it is completely irrelevant to the course content. I understand wanting to be able to change your colors. So in VS Code, if you go to settings, which you can get to by going to code, the menu right there, preferences, and then settings. And then this takes us to all of the settings. So there's tons of things you can change. You can change the font size, the font that's used in your editor, that's tab size. I mean, there's hundreds of settings here. And if you go to search and you look for theme, we'll see all the settings that have to do with changing the color theme. So I can change the color theme. There's a bunch of pre-installed ones. Now I have more installed. I'll show you how to do that too in a moment. And you'll see, like, if I want to use this Monokai theme, it immediately changes. And now I have this different background color, different text. If I use Solarized Light, I can get a light theme. But the theme that I use is called Material Theme, Pale Night, High Contrast. So you probably aren't going to see that pre-installed because I actually went and installed that myself. And that brings me to the next thing I'll show you. So just to wrap up the settings here, there's a bunch of them. I'm not going to change any of them. I believe I've made my font size larger just to look better on videos. So if you wanted to do that, you can go to font, change the font size here. But again, there's a million settings that you can play around with. And then you can always search right here to find them. There's also a shortcut. I believe it's Control, on Windows and Command, on a Mac to open up the text editor. Okay. The next thing I want to show you, though, is how to install what are called extensions. They're basically like add-ons or little tiny apps you can add in to VS Code. There's a tab over here called Extensions. There's a shortcut, too. For me on a Mac, come back. It is Command-Shift-X. But I just click here because I don't do it that much. And then you can search for hundreds, I believe it's actually tens of thousands of different extensions that other people have written. It's like a little app store. And the one that I've installed for the theme is called Material Theme. So if you search for it, if it doesn't show up for you, just search for Material if you want the same theme. Here it is, Community Material Theme. Click on it, and then you can click Install. For me, it says uninstall. So I'll just do that. I've uninstalled it. Now I want to reinstall it. And then it's going to ask me to pick my theme. So this is one way of doing it. I'll do the high contrast pale night. That's the one I'm already using. Or you can open up the settings as I just showed you. Now, while we're here, there's another extension I recommend installing called Live Server. There it is. So if you search for Live Server under extensions, we're not going to use it just yet, but we will be using it in the course. And if we're installing extensions, might as well do it now. I'll bring it up later too when we start to use it. So click Install, and you won't have to do anything after that, because we're not going to use it just yet. And then there's a bunch of other things you can install if you're interested. You can find all sorts of blog posts about the best extensions and different tools to add into VS Code. And we'll wrap up here. Let me close this down. I'll just show you the basic workflow. If you have never used VS Code, it's very similar to probably any text editor you've ever used. What I can do is make a new file, either going to File, New File, or using the shortcut listed right there, Command-N. So I'll use a shortcut. So it makes me a nice new empty file. I can name it by saving it. So same deal, File, Save, or I can do the shortcut Command-S for me, and then I'll give it a name like demo dot and then some extension. And we're going to talk about the right extensions for HTML and CSS. Spoiler, it's just .html and .css. So might as well, I'll make it an HTML file even though we don't know HTML. And now it says .html, and if you notice down here, it says that I'm using HTML as the language mode, which is what I want. It gives me HTML features so I can do things like this very easily. We'll learn how to do that soon. And it gives me HTML syntax highlighting, so if I start typing HTML, it looks like it. It recognizes the syntax and gives me colors. If I start typing CSS in here, which again, we don't know any of it, it's not being highlighted because it's treated as HTML. But I can change that by clicking on select language right there and then search for CSS, and now it's treating it as CSS. And that's just the basic workflow. Make a new file, I use the shortcuts, save the file. It detects the language automatically, usually, but if it doesn't or you want to change what language you're using, you can control it down here. So let's go back to HTML, and that's it. I'm going to just delete this file. All right, so that's a very quick intro to VS Code.